foreign aid, and neocolonial projects. And for this topic, it helps to understand a little bit about what the context is here. So after decolonization in after World War II, but oftentimes in the late 50s, early 60s, what had happened was many of these economies had been structured during the colonial period for one purpose only, which is to take raw resources, extract them to the nearest port or national boundary or airport, where they could be airlifted or boat lifted or taken away in some way by the colonial power, who then would profit off the sale of those goods or would manufacture finished goods and then deliver those finished goods back to the colony and sell them to make money. So essentially, everything that was going on in many of these colonies, former colonies, was exploitative, was extractive. The mother country, as it were, they had designed the economy, they had industrialized the economy to do only one thing. And that one thing was to take resources out of the country. Okay. So when the colonial power left, they didn't change the economy back to one that was actually useful to the people who were living there. The economy was still set up in a way that it was extractive and exploitative primarily. So in many ways, the colonial powers continued to benefit from the profits that were generated. Now, some countries were able to kind of turn this around, but it's been difficult. And actually, some of the best examples of how this was all set up is that Nigeria is a great example, but India is a great example too, is if you look at the way the rail lines were built, if you look at the way the British built the railroads were monodirectional for the most part. And the rail lines went from resource output centers like mines and quarries and farms and things, and went directly to ports where the goods were then taken and sold. So just because a colonial power leaves and their flag comes down off the flagpole doesn't mean that those railways now go to domestic factories where the goods can be transformed into no longer being raw materials or be sold in communities that need them, right? So this economic colonialism actually persisted in a lot of countries for a while, and in many cases does still persist in some way, shape, or form. So there has been, and by the way, as I talked about on previous shows, there has been an incredible amount of destabilizing forces on many of these countries, causing civil wars, coups, breakaways, and all sorts of things, right? So the formerly colonized powers have reached out to the former colonizers and said, hey, could we get some money and could we get some aid? And whether that aid is military aid or financial aid or loans and other stuff. And there have been oftentimes the colonial powers have acquiesced to some form of aid, but that aid doesn't really look like it's particularly helpful. So, for example, instead of giving money directly, they might give loans. But on the condition of those loans was to fundamentally change the way the economy worked. And it was often used, and these loans were often used to stymie left-wing or anti-capitalist governments from coming to power and requiring neoliberal reforms. We've seen this in a non-previously colonized country with Greece, is actually a great example of where the IMF loan style was kind of used in a non-colonial country. Germany spent a lot of time kind of imposing neoliberalism on Greece, even though it wasn't interested in that project. But a lot of what happened with these loans is that they were used to force economies to go particular ways. And by the way, these loans, the conditions of these loans in the long run were actually going to help the former colonizers anyway. So it's not really aid. And when military aid is provided, sure, the military aid might be there to fight, an extremist group, Al-Shabaab, or what's the one in Nigeria? I can't think of it. Boko Haram or any other group, or the Islamic State or some Islamic State affiliate, whatever, right? So in theory, the voice crack, sorry. In theory, the foreign military is there to deliver security. However, oftentimes what that foreign military actually ends up doing is they end up protecting the assets or items that are important to the colonizer. And by the way, nowhere do we see a better example of this than what the US was doing in Afghanistan. Now, of course, we're not there any longer, but that was, or in Syria too. In theory, we were there to keep the peace, but we were guarding the oil fields and we were ramping up oil production in Afghanistan and in Syria. So were we really there to protect the people, or were we there to protect our interests in the natural resources? And the same thing, by the way, is going on in France. There was a very humorous exchange on Al Jazeera this past week, talking about whether the French military should leave West Africa. The French military has a large presence, about 5,000, 6,000 soldiers in West Africa, specifically in formerly French colonies. And in theory, they're there to maintain stability and to fight terrorism and all that good stuff. However, the complaint by many of these countries has been that the French government is actually either directly or indirectly causing their troops to only protect things that the French government cares about. And they're not necessarily protecting the individual citizens of the relevant countries, or even doing that good of a job in fighting the baddies that they're supposedly there to fight. So these aid processes essentially become neo-colonialist ventures. What is happening is that this new form of colonialism is being reimposed, oftentimes by the same powers who initiated colonialism the first time around. And by the way, once again, for the benefit of those formerly colonial, now neo-colonial powers. And this style of imperialism does not actually help in the liberation of these formerly colonized countries. It instead just subjugates them in a different way, just changes the manner in which these countries are subjugated, but doesn't fundamentally change the economic conditions on the ground, nor does it change the security situation on the ground. So, and I mentioned that this piece on this discussion Al Jazeera was funny. I think it was called "Should French Soldiers Leave the Sahel?" And the reason it was so humorous is because there was one individual on the panel who, I mean, he had a bone to pick with the French military. He was saying that the French troops were ineffective, which is true, but he also went back into like French historical defeats and was just listing out every French historical defeat, like in the past 80 to 200 years. It was genuinely hilarious. You should give it a watch if you can. And the host is just desperately trying to get this conversation back on track. But this guy just keeps going on about how bloody useless the French military is. And sure, it was a funny part of a very, very serious conversation, but I think the point that we should get out of it, not this gentleman's point about how useless the French army is, but the point we should get out of it is, yeah, the French troops in this case are not being effective, so they should leave, right? If you're asked, so, and this could be any context, right? Say a friend of yours, asks you to come over and help them with something, and instead, I don't know, change a light bulb. I don't know. That's not really a thing people ask friends to help them with, but whatever, right? So moving. Okay, there's an example. So say, you ask a friend to help you move a couch up a set of stairs. Just work with me here, okay? And instead of actually helping you move the couch up the set of stairs, once the two of you get the couch halfway through, your friend decides, nah, I'm good, and walks back down the stairs, leaving you holding all the weight of the couch, now halfway up the stairs, which of course falls and breaks. because the friend did not do the thing, you would want them to leave, right? Because they're not doing the thing that was asked of them. And the same thing applies here, whether it's the French military or it's these loans or anything else. This aid should just vanish, should just disappear, because it's actually doing more harm than good. These loans, these conditional loans, these military entrenchments in these countries, it's not helping anyone. The only, well, that's not true. It's helping the neo-colonizer, but it's not helping anyone else. And if the purpose of asking them to come in or asking for a loan or asking for any of this stuff is to actually improve the lives and livelihoods of those people who are doing their best to stay safe in a world that was essentially created as dangerous for them by the colonizer, then if it's not improving that, they need to go. They just need to leave. It's not worth it being there. So I do hope that the nations, I think it's a lot of the ECOWAS nations, but I hope the nations that are subject to French aid ask them to leave. Mali, Niger, all them, I think they should just ask them to go. Clearly, the French aren't doing the job they're supposed to do, and this has nothing to do with the French, by the way. It just has to do with, the type of aid that's being given. But there's no reason they should continue to be there. If they're only protecting French interests and not the interests of the governments who asked them to come there, tell them to leave. They shouldn't be there. And they shouldn't be there, especially because these projects are essentially excuses for the countries to protect their assets in these countries that they're effectively recolonizing through this very strange roundabout imperialism, which I think we should fundamentally be against.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.